Good evening. Welcome everybody. Councilmember Chris Ray. I'm going to call the December 19th, 2023 City Council Ad Hoc Finance Policy Committee meeting to order. This is a new temporary committee that was formed by the City Council to provide recommendations on proposed amendments to the city's financial management policy. Our first order of business today is special business. And tonight first order of business will be the election of a chair. And I will now open nominations. Are there any nominations for chair?
I nominate Chris Ray for chair.
Are there any other nominations? Okay, if there are no further nominations, the nominations are closed, and Councilmember Ray, being the only nominee, will be elected as chair. Thank you. All right, we have just one order of business, regular business today. And that is ID 1570, amending financial management policy. And that's going to be presented by our city attorney, Rachel Bender-Turpin, and I think Robert Mood too. Yeah.
Point of order?
No, I'm with you. I haven't forgotten that. Before we get to the first order of business, the first thing we will do is public comment. There'll be multiple public comment opportunities tonight's meeting. There's a general public comment opportunity at the beginning of the meeting, or you may make comments after the presentation and council question and answer period on tonight's agenda. Members of the public may address the council at this time, either in person or virtually. Those who have signed up in advance will be called first. If you're joining, is anybody joining us virtually?
No.
Okay, then I'm not going to worry about that until later. And there's no one in the room. So I'm going to say we probably are not going to have any public comment at this opportunity. So we will move on to our first order of business, which is, as I mentioned earlier, ID 1570. Welcome, Rachel. Good to see you.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. Rachel Turpin, City Attorney for the record. And tonight we're going to be talking more about the proposed amendments to the financial management policy. And I'll try to keep my enthusiasm a little bit level and to get very excited about this. But anyway, I appreciate this committee being set up and I look forward to working with you. So with that, the purpose of tonight's meeting is to discuss and obtain feedback from the committee on the proposed amendments to the financial management policy. Next slide. We're looking for your feedback and direction on the proposed amendments, specifically issues regarding contracting thresholds, grant thresholds, and donations. As was discussed in the committee of the whole meeting on November 13th, the ad hoc committee option was selected to look at these so that we can all have a more detailed and personal conversation about these various issues. Next slide, please. Just a little background for mostly the public, honestly. The City Council adopts financial management policies to provide guidance to city staff and officials on how to do business and also to set internal controls and oversight for financial transactions that then the auditor uses to make sure that we're correctly overseeing our finances. The current financial management policy was adopted back in 2017 and there have been several amendments to it since that time. Next slide. This is a project that has been in process for over a year. It started back with an interdepartmental working group meeting back in November of 2022. That group, made up of representatives from all departments, met throughout 2022 or the end of 2022 and throughout most of 2023 to discuss the financial management policy, particularly contracting, and various issues that had come up over the last few years with interpretation of the policy and with various things that staff felt could be improved upon to make our operations more efficient. Draft amendments to the financial management policy were then presented at the November 13th Committee of the Whole meeting. At that time is when the council decided to form this committee. So that's where we are here tonight. Some feedback that we received at the Committee of the Whole meeting are things like, how are we going to ensure diligence and visibility if the thresholds are raised? That being asked in particular because right now, a lot of the public visibility of our documents is by way of them being on the agenda and therefore making it into our records center that way. So I'd love to talk about, that I think other ways potentially that we can ensure diligence and visibility if we do make some edits here. The council asked for some data that I think we've provided tonight. For instance, what's the number of public works contracts that are between the current threshold for council approval of $100,000 and the proposed threshold, which is $350,000. There was requested clarifying language for contract authorization, specifying that the contract aligned with the budgeted use. So people thought we should work on the language in that section a little bit and make it clear what it meant to be budgeted. They requested donation language specified that a donation be aligned with the supported project or program. That we, in that same section, that we align the two sections relating to program specific donations. There was a suggestion to reiterate the financial thresholds on page 10 above the list of items. So essentially just giving another visual cue of what the particular thresholds are so people can easily reference those as they read through the section on delegation of authority. There was a suggestion to include guidance regarding messaging to the city council of contracts that have been entered. So even, let's say, a contract wouldn't need council approval under the threshold, we discussed the need for some sort of guidance so that staff know when it's appropriate to inform council of a contract anyway, even if their approval isn't needed. And we, at that point, that's when the recommendation was made to form this committee, which we are here for tonight. The purpose of the ad hoc committee is to further consider the proposed amendments and the council feedback, and then to make recommendations on the proposed amendments or other amendments that should be made instead of what's been proposed. One of the big items under discussion is public works contracts. So a little more information about that. The total city public works contracts for all dollar amounts in 2022 were 52, and then there were 84 public works agreements that the city executed in 2023. Council approved 5 in 2022 and 2 in 2023 that fell between the 100,000 and 300,000. That should be 350,000 annual thresholds. So that number goes to show you the number that would be the council would no longer see those 5 or those 2 in 2023 under the proposed amendments. There were, of course, more above 350,000 that the council did approve. The council approval, and just a note, the council approval is currently based on the contracts that have 100,000 or more of annual expenditures, not the total contract amount. That's important to note just because some cities do it differently and it's per contract, but our thresholds are on an annual basis.
Question, Councilmember Hunt.
Yes, thank you. Am I right that most of the ones that were not between the change in the thresholds, that they were above the threshold, so they were more expensive?
Of the 80.
Yeah, of the 84. So the way I read it was
data
almost everything is
you?
above the threshold, but it doesn't
Yes.
actually say that.
I mean,
No, it's above and below.
What?
So that's just the total, it's, Councilmember Hunt, it's the total of all the contracts that were approved by the city. So some of them went to council, some of them did not go to council. It's the total amount in the entire city that we were.
I think what Councilmember Hunt is asking is how many contracts did council, Public Works contracts did council approve? How many were beyond 350,000?
I have to split that up. I can get that information.
Yeah, that'd be great. We can get that. We should have the data here, so he can probably find it now. All right. The proposal in front of you this evening is to adopt standardized signing thresholds for all contract types, essentially using the framework that we currently have in place for professional services agreements and then applying that to all types of contracts for ease of administration. The approval thresholds would apply to all types of contracts that the city enters into. This would include things like affidavits of ownership, which are real basic documents where we just say, yes, we own this property, and we're, fine with our lessee applying for a permit to do the work on that property. For instance, that comes up a lot in the case of cell towers that we lease off of city property. It would apply to real estate purchase and sale agreements, easements, similar type of property conveyance documents. It would apply to settlement agreements. It would apply to right of entry agreements, those types of agreements that allow the city to either go on a public property to do some sort of investigation, or where we allow private property owners to come onto our property to do some sort of investigation. Usually occurs in this context of property acquisition.
Another question, Councilmember Martz.
Would it count towards public works projects?
Yes, it would it would also apply. So public works contracts the same threshold would apply to those as well. So council approval over 350,000.
Sorry.
All right. Next slide. I would apply to here. Even these is just another more types of contracts that it would apply to. Contracts for housekeeping changes, for various amendments of contracts that maybe council already did approve, but where the amendment isn't changing any material term or condition. Essentially, it's just maybe extending it for another month so it can finish, or something along those lines, some sort of basic, somebody forgot to include this particular reference to this work, so we amended to add that as well. Basic types of amendments. It would apply to leases for materials and supplies in addition to just leases for real property. This is a weird issue that's come up in the last couple months for me, which is why it's in here, where we had a department that wanted to rent space in a self-storage facility, and I had to say, well, that has to go to council because technically it is a lease agreement. So things like that, to maybe make things like that a little bit easier for staff to do. It would apply to all types of interagency agreements that aren't interlocal agreements. Not all agreements between two municipalities are interlocal agreements. Sometimes we just contract with another agency for a basic service. An example that I've seen come to time is places will buy their ice or their de-icer, their salt for the streets from, another entity that has it. They supply it for them. That's not really a joint program or purpose, so it's not an interlocal agreement, but it is an agreement between two governmental agencies. And it would apply to contracts for short-term use of facilities when the use is controlled by and consistent with the city policies. That's things like using parks, rentals under those policies that are in effect. Slide. Additional changes that have been made to the contract threshold section have included language to provide that funds have that a contract expenditure is allowed, but when funds have been appropriated by the city council in the biennial budget, and the contract does not require expenditures that exceed available fund balances, that the expenditure be consistent with the city's goals and policies, those policies and goals having been adopted by the city council. And another request that has come in too, that's in here, is that that it would, to bump the contract length from 2 years to 3 years. So it would also allow for contracts for 3-year terms or less, with the exception of software licensing agreements, which already we're allowed to have 5-year term for. Importantly, the policy amendments clarify when contracts can be amended and when those amendments require city council approval. Like I said before, there's times where maybe an amendment is so minor that it is not worth the city council's time to consider it in a city council meeting, or more often what comes up is these things are time sensitive and there may be a timing issue. We realized something should have been included and it wasn't. We're often, I would say the most frequent amendment that I see of this nature would be to extend the term. Sometimes folks don't realize that the term of their contract is up until 2 weeks before it's up, and they realize, oh no, this isn't done yet. We need another couple of months on this, but we don't even have time to go to a council meeting. So it would allow those types of things. It would authorize finance to audit all departmental contracts for compliance with the policy. That's arguably something that finance could do anyway, but I thought it was important to include it in the document so that finance doesn't have to argue with other departments about whether or not they can be, rifling through their stuff and interrogating them. And it would also revise the city's competitive procurement requirements to match those found in state law and Chapter 3.70 of the IMC, which is essentially a restatement of state law. It's just a little bit poorly worded, so I'd like to make some amendments to make it a little bit clearer. And then also, as part of this will be an education component too, because I looking at this over the last year or so, it's become clear that maybe some of the practices that the city has in place don't necessarily match what we have in the IMC. And the good news about it is we're doing more than is required, but the bad news is we're doing more than we need. We're wasting a little time by not just going with our IMC, which has a little bit more leeway in it. So part of that will be just making the financial policy match what we already have in the IMC and then cleaning up the IMC to make sure that it's a little clearer. There's a proposal to allow administrative acceptance of grants that are valued in amounts of $100,000 or less, provided that any requirement for matching funds is budgeted, so that there's money in the budget for a match if the grant requires it. Often they do. Sometimes we see small little grants, though, that do not require a match. Some additional information about grants. Council approved 16 in 2023. 11 of them were for $100,000 or less. That gives you an idea.
Quick question,
Yes.
Councilmember Martz?
Thank you. Of those 11 grants that were 100,000 or less, how many of them were part of the general human services sort of raft of grants?
You have that
I can get back to you. Let me see if I have it, but if not, I'll get back to you.
might be in the spreadsheet. It is. In 2022, council approved 22 grants, and 16 of those were for 100,000 or less. There's also a proposal regarding donations. The proposal is to delegate authority to the city council to allow the mayor to administratively accept donations up to $100,000 when the donation can be used for any municipal purpose. So essentially just free money for the city to do whatever it feels the best use of that money would be, as determined by council who approves the budget. Or if the donation is earmarked for use by a city program, and the donation can then be used for any equipment, items, or expenses related to that program.
Another question, Councilmember
Yes?
Martz?
Can you give me an example of something that would meet the second criteria but not the first criteria?
Yes. So this actually has come up. This is one of the impetus for this discussion on donations is we have a local employer who would like to, they have employees there that would like to set up a gift matching program with City of Issaquah for the Green Issaquah program specifically. So they want to be able to donate these employees to the city and then have their employer, Microsoft, match those donations. Right now, the way things are set up in the city, we would actually, even, if we're talking about like a $20 donation and a $20 match from Microsoft, we'd have to go to council to accept those. So this would allow those types of program-specific donations, but only if they can be used for basically any portion of that program. Because what we didn't want to have is folks say, well, we want to give to Green Issaquah, but we only want our donations to pay for like the trees that you plant at an event or something like that. We want to make sure that they can be used for any purpose in that program, and then they would be able to be accepted administratively. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you. So the options for this committee are to either recommend adoption of the proposed amendments to the financial management policy as have been previously recommended by the administration, to recommend different amendments to the financial management policy, or you could recommend that no amendments be made to the financial management policy at this time. I hope that is not the outcome. I would love one or two more, but that's also one of your choices. Up to you.
Thank you, Rachel. Before we get into questions, we want to talk a little bit about how we want to kind of go through this. I just going back to the discussion we had at the COW, the Committee of the Whole, about why we might want an ad hoc, and we were starting to get into a bit of wordsmithing, and so I would rather do that in a smaller setting if we want to wordsmith, but also do we have some kind of overarching goals that we want to get out of this, to make sure that as we move forward with these policies that we get them. And I had two of them, and they were represented there, and that was the accountability, due diligence / and then transparency. Are there other kind of overarching goals the committee would like to see us hit? Councilmember Hunt?
This was also touched upon. I think one of the goals was to make the process easy to understand and implement, or straightforward to understand and implement.
Councilmember Martz?
Thanks. I would say an important goal is to maintain the council's role in setting policy. I think, money is is an awful important empowering agent for policy. And so as we go about this, thinking about in what places does it potentially abrogate council responsibility to set policy to the administration. So that's a factor, at least for me.
Councilmember Hunt?
The last one that I had was efficiency. So for example, the $20 example, we want to make sure that we're able to efficiently administer these policies.
I think it's an interesting balancing act, just to opine a little bit between how do you maintain your council responsibility for policy oversight, and at the same time try to optimize. I guess that's what we're trying to find, is that that optimum level of involvement. So given that, how would we like to proceed to go through this? I know I have a number of just questions about kind of what things, because there are a ton of changes in the policy, and a lot of them are obvious, but some of them are less maybe clear what the intent was. So So any thoughts on how you'd like to proceed through that? This is a little difficult, kind of, this is
I
be a
know.
good
It's
conversation around a table.
A table, I had the same thought.
But, you know, that's kind of not where we're at. So, Councilmember Hunt.
A suggestion would be we could go through, make sure all of our questions are answered, and then there were the 3 sections of things that are in the presentation, and so we could go through those one by one, and then if there are other categories of things that we wanted to potentially recommend changes to the full council on other things in the financial policy, then we could address those after the first buckets. Yeah.
Sounds good to me. Well, let's kind of start with just questions we have about the current revisions as presented. And I'm open to, anybody want to kind of go first? Looks like Councilmember March would like to go first.
I will stride boldly forward and say that 350 is too high a number. I'm open to a number higher than 100, but 350 seems too high, and here's why. I would like to think in terms of 1 FTE worth of effort as a possible, you know, how do you say where are you into the realm of policy? And to me, a mechanism could be what's the equivalent of an FTE worth of labor per year, right? So my question for Director Hammoud would be, you know, sort of what's the average salary and then carrying cost? If, you know, your average salary is 100, and your carrying cost is 60%, and that's $160,000, right? That would be a potential criteria. So, but really behind it is that question that I had about where's policy, and 1 FTE feels like a good break point.
Councilmember Hunt?
I'm wondering if it was possible to identify if the majority of those grants were above the existing, the suggested threshold or below the current threshold.
You have that?
Rachel, I can pull that up.
Thank
Give me
you.
just a moment here. All right, so you're looking at the 2023 council-approved grants. Let me scroll down here to show you what would be below the 100,000. And so would no longer be coming to you under the current proposal.
Well, right, and it didn't come to us. I mean, it came to us. Okay, yeah, right. So the in between where we're moving the thresholds was only a couple
Yeah,
out of this whole list.
Right. Currently there's no threshold. So any acceptance of grants comes to the city council for approval, and the proposal is to set that at $100,000, above $100,000. So it would just be these top 5 here. If we look at this past year.
Councilmember March, you have a comment, question?
I want to make sure we don't compare apples to oranges. I was talking about expenditures, not about acceptance of grants. So it's the expenditure side of it that to me is the policy question, and the threshold for expenditure, I'm fine with that having potentially be different than the threshold for grant. Just to be clear. Right, and I also was talking about the expenditure one, which so contract thresholds was the first one on our direction needed. And that's the one that I was wondering about. That one, there's only a few between the thresholds.
Right. Do you have that one up that you can pull to share?
The list in the packet just identifies, the 2 and the 5.
The 2 and the 5.
So we don't have unless Robert has one available, we don't, I think, have a complete list of all the public works contracts that were approved by council. So I don't know that we can pull up the 350 and above from 23. That's certainly something we could compile pretty quickly, but we don't have that on hand.
Okay, I think that would be helpful because I think part of the original intent of this question, which I believe was from Council President Walsh, was to, I think, see what this does in terms of what we're already approving versus what would happen if we change the threshold, which we can't quite tell from this, except to say that the difference between these thresholds is only a few of the contracts. So it's impacting a small number of contracts. So that all said, from what I can tell, I am also okay with going with the lower number of thresholds, in part because when we look at our goals as far as accountability and efficiency and making this transparent, it seems like this doesn't make it that much less efficient because it's only a few that are impacted if we have the lower threshold, and if we have the lower threshold, then we retain more of the council's ability to review these, et cetera. So it meets those other goals.
So council members, in the list provided to us by my staff, we did not determine, and again, we can double check with Tish after this meeting to verify that information, but we did not see any contracts in 22 or 23 that were over 350,000 go to council. Because again, it's an annual threshold, so it's not the total contract amount, it's just the annual expenditure amount of those contracts.
Is that just regular contracts, not public? Because I'm certain that we've had. I don't think that can be true. And I just know that haven't we approved some large public works contracts this year?
So just to kind of ask a kind of follow-up question there, are you saying that if we set the limit at 350, we would see very, very few contracts come to council?
I don't think that we can, I don't think that's what Director Humid was saying, because he was once again referring to, I think the list that he's looking at is professional services, which are the non-professional. Those are public works contracts. Those are not. Those are definitely professional.
Councilmember
service.
Ray, I have taken a look at this briefly. What you'll see is the really large capital projects that have design and build contracts that are well over 300,000.
Councilmember Hunt.
Okay, so to clarify, there was a question asked by a council member in our previous meeting, and I believe the intent of that question was to understand between 100 and 300,000 annual threshold, which is what's on the slide that is follow-up public works contracts. In the information that's provided, it says there were only 2 in 2023 for all of 84. There were 84 contracts. 2 are in this threshold. So I'm just saying,
Yes, that's correct.
it's a small percentage.
It's a small percentage.
Moving this threshold would impact. And these are public work contracts, so that's my original assumption, was that most of them are higher.
Exactly.
So moving this doesn't make a big difference, and most of them are higher, so most of them do come to council in either scenario. So if we can get confirmation on that, that'd be great, but that's where I'm headed with this. So I think we agree on the direction that we should go, maybe with slightly different reasons.
Councilmember Martz.
Just to point out that, the administration might be more tempted to use that mechanism if they had a larger potential threshold, right? So it's certainly valuable to look at the past, but it's also, if the administration had a mechanism where they didn't have to, not necessarily this administration, but a future administration, and they just wanted to do some stuff without council's engagement, they might wind up using that more than the has been.
Rachel.
One thing I would love you to consider, because it's just caused confusion right here in this conversation, is if you do decide that you would like a different threshold than 350,000, I would strongly encourage that different threshold be simply for the public works contracts, because as this discussion has shown us, it's very difficult sometimes to decide if a contract is a regular service contract or a professional service contract. There's no definition in state law of what a professional service is. Some people say that taking photographs is a professional service. Other people say that only, CPAs and attorneys are professional services because they have malpractice insurance. These are the kind of things that come to staff, and we have to sit and make a determination about. So it would be very useful to have the same limit for all services. Public Works is different because we have to go through a whole different process with that anyway. It wouldn't be that onerous for us to, keep those separate, because, folks have to go through bidding for that. So we have to know it's easy to know what a Public Works project is, what that service is. Other services get a little bit dicier.
I have a question first. So what's the limit right now on services, professional services, and public works contracts? Are we divergent?
Yes.
Okay.
So right now we have a limit of 350,000 for professional services, but all other services and public works is at 100,000. So that's where we get a lot of confusion.
Got it. How much of the contracting we do for professional services is done through some sort of a procurement vehicle versus, how is it generally done?
I would say for the most part, it's either done with the procurement. It's done with the procurement at some point. I'll say that we often see folks entering into additional professional services contracts with folks, after that initial RFP has been out, because they've liked working with those folks and want to work with them again. But I'd say for the most part, the ones I see did go through a competitive process, or there's something along the lines of, like me, trying to find, reaching out and finding an attorney to handle a specific, right now, like we have a criminal case, and I had to call up some folks with criminal experience to try to see if I could get a professional services agreement with somebody, for that work. So it might be like little one-off things that don't go through an RFP process, but I'd say in large part, those things do get bid out as well.
Good, thanks. Councilmember Martz?
No, just to continue this sort of philosophically, I mean, if we said the number was, in my hypothetical example, 160 was $100,000 plus $60,000 carrying cost, then I'd be fine with all three of them. So that number would be fine with across.
Well, let me ask a real pointed question of my colleagues. Do we want to rationalize them to be the same? Because I think there's some value in having the thresholds the same across all classes of service. At least that's what I think I'm hearing. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. I mean,
Yeah.
I think of course, I'd be remiss to not mention that I think staff will be lowering the limit below 350 for, professional services. That will be difficult for
Yes.
staff to
So
get
really
used
the
to,
philosophy that was being applied was let's rationalize them, get them in the same place, and let's take the one that's the highest and we'll use that as our plateau. So that was sort of the rationale. That feels like to me what the rationale was.
Yes, you are correct.
For that number.
You read my mind.
Versus some other number.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Any thoughts on that?
I think if you say, in my criteria of one FTE constituted a policy, putting a full person on something for a year is making it a policy, then that's the same whether it's a professional services somebody or a public works somebody or a services somebody.
I'm going to go back to the efficiency question. Would lowering the professional services contract have a significant or any impact on overall operational efficiency of the city? I think that's a worthwhile question for.
And yes, I do think it would, looking at I saw a lengthy list of all the contracts when I was working on the material. I don't have it right here in front of me, unfortunately, but there are a lot of public, professional services contracts that are, within that up to 350,000, and a lot that are between 100 and 350.
Other thoughts on the contracting limit? Councilmember Hunt, do you have a kind of a number in your mind? And that's question number one. And number two is, do you want to rationalize the three? I think we should rationalize the categories.
Well, it seems that there's an argument to be made for the efficiency for keeping the 350 the way it is. That is one of our goals. That would be good to get the information to support that for when this comes back to council. I think on the other two, it doesn't seem like from the information here that it's improving efficiency to increase the threshold, at least with the public work contracts, because again, it's like 2% that this is impacting. So for the other two, it could be 100 or 300, and that difference affects 2%. I'm okay with 100 because I think that better addresses the other goals we have about accountability and transparency and things going through the same process.
One option that I thought of earlier on this would be to set, that would be significantly lower than the 350 for public works contracts. I think if you were to say that any contract that required public bidding because it met the statute for public bidding under the statute. So right now, a public works contract has to go out for formal public bidding if it exceeds, it's something like $75,000 for a single trade or $116,000 for multi-crafts or something like that. I think if you were to at least harmonize those numbers, like for instance, there's a lot of things for staff to remember here, I guess is what I'm getting at. And I think it would be nice if at least the council public works contract threshold matched the bidding threshold. So we had some, just so there are fewer numbers, honestly, for folks to memorize.
I would be in favor of that as a concept. And also I did notice, I don't have it here, but I did notice that in the tables for these thresholds, there used to be a column that talked about what had to go to bid, and it was different for the different numbers. So I think simplifying it so you not only don't need that column, but that column went away in this draft. But
That column was not accurate in terms of like what we have in the IMC, and that's why that column went away. So instead, now they get a very lengthy contract manual instead that explains what all of those are. But yes, that was the discrepancy I found. I took me a very long time trying to figure out where that column even came from, and the only thing I can think is that it was just an error that got perpetuated.
Okay, well, good that got corrected. So then the new number would be the number that is, so it would be that council has to approve, and the same things that council has to approve would go to bid.
Exactly.
I think that makes sense.
Rachel, are you saying that the table that got struck that was on page 9, that column that says city requirements would the obtain 3 quotes or obtain 5 quotes or whatever, that
It looked
may
like
not be
someone,
accurate?
yes, it looked like someone tried to base it on what was in the IMC, but maybe didn't understand the difference between like the limited public works process and just a regular, not using the limited public works process, but it being within the amount that you could. Like, it's kind of a confusing thing, because if something's under, $50,000, for instance, you can use regular bidding if you want. You don't have to go out for bids at all, or you can use this limited public works process or the small works roster process, and this is all in the IMC. And instead of taking everything from the IMC, it looks like folks just took the requirements for like the limited public works project. So I think it's just flat out error.
Is what I'm hearing, and this is why I wish we were sitting around the table and it'd be easier. But where if it requires going out to bid, the resulting contract would be coming back to the council for approval. And if it doesn't go out to bid, then it can be approved without coming. Is that what you're suggesting?
Correct. Yes, correct.
I'm seeing half a nods. Councilmember Marks, what you're thinking?
I'm confused. Say it again. I didn't follow you.
All right, well, that's not good.
I understood when we were talking about three numbers. Now I don't know what we're talking about.
Well, we were talking about three numbers, but we're trying to bring in a fourth concept, which is if a contract that's being awarded is the result of going out to, it requires a competitive procurement process, then the resulting contract would go to come back to council for approval. So if the threshold for competitive procurement is X, whatever that number is, then the threshold for council approval is that same X. And if it's less than X, then it's the administration can approve the contract.
Provided that it's budgeted.
Provided that it's budgeted.
For which of those three categories? Services, professional services, and public works?
Public works.
Just public works.
Just public works.
But we don't know what that number is. We're just saying.
Oh, I
whatever-
can tell you what it is. It's $116,155. Very specific.
Nice. Well, I mean, that's close to the 100,000. It has a very small practical effect, but it's almost a Scrivener's thing.
Well,
But yeah,
what it is, it looks like it's some cost of living escalation on the 100,000 that was originally there.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
basically what it was. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I would have a problem with that.
All right, I think we actually came up with an idea here.
I got that
So in the
one.
public works projects, we'll tie, bring it to council to whether or not it goes out for competitive.
Okay, that makes sense.
And that's defined in IMC, whatever.
It is, correct. And in state law. I have the IMC, everything written in the IMC so that it just reflects whatever is in state law, so we don't have to update the IMC every time it changes and it does change, and it changes very incrementally. Like before it was 116,150, it was $5,000 less or something. It's pretty small. So is it okay if I then write it so that it just matches the RCW rather than putting the exact amount in, so we don't have to update it every, okay, perfect, thank you.
I think that makes a ton of sense.
They're never gonna like triple it, so it's never gonna.
But it does give us something to anchor to, which I think is important.
I think that will be really helpful. There's just so many numbers that it gets a lot of, makes
Yes.
it more complicated.
All right, so we got the public works ones, and then the professional services are right now 350, and then you were mentioning that the challenge that we have is making a determination between, is that a professional services or is that just a services contract?
Yes.
And we've got different thresholds for
It's
those.
exactly, and it really is just an arbitrary decision to a certain point, which one is, and that's just, I can keep doing what I've been doing, which is going, oh, I think that's professional services, or oh, it's general services, but it never feels good to like guess at what the council was intending. I would love to have it just be cleaner.
Are there different procurement thresholds for professional services and services?
No, there's actually very few procurement requirements in state law for any services other than public works, except for a few random ones like your newspaper provider. Very odd. But yeah, state law treats all services besides public works the same, which is what it makes it more complicated when we have the different threshold.
Okay, fair. Councilmember March, your thought?
Sure. I mean, the crux of this is the administration is saying, gosh, wouldn't it be great if those numbers were the same and they should be the higher number? And I'm saying, God, I'd be fine with them being the same, but I'm not fine with them being the higher number. I think they should be some criteria that we develop. I propose the idea, but, you know, I'm not great with both of them going to 350.
That's fair. Councilmember Hunt, any thoughts on that? I think it's an interesting idea something tangible, something to point to, something to touch that says this number is this because of these things. I mean, I like the concept.
I have no idea how the 350 was originally determined.
Do we have some, I mean, this is maybe going back to where Councilmember Hunt was just a moment ago, and the efficiency question. How many things would, if, let's say we lowered it to, I'm going to do a little Kentucky windage myself and call it 200, how many services and professional services contracts that result in that or actually just professional services contract historically come to the council that now would historically have not gone to council? Lowered that number. And the flip side of that is how many just general services contracts historically have gone to not, I mean, it almost feels to me like wash out. Councilmember Martz?
I have an idea. So I think you have a four square here, right? A 2 by 2, and you have on the one axis you have 100, you have 200, you have 350. On the other axis you have services and you have professional services, right? And so the question is, what is in those 4 boxes, right? Because that would tell us everything we need to know. I don't expect you to have that off the top of your head, Robert, but I suspect that would allow everyone to say, gosh, that box is really huge and unwieldy, or, oh, no, that box really should be, those are policy questions.
I think we do have this information, at least for 2022 and 23. Robert, are you connected to the meeting? Are you able to share the Excel spreadsheet you sent me a couple of weeks ago? Because that has basically all the contracts. And so I could at least tell you what would be between, like I could tell you what's over 100,000 here. I think that's essentially what you're trying to kind of get at here. What you'd be missing, or so this is because this is definitely both professional services and services here that I'm looking at. It looks like there were.
Yeah, and I think the thing we're really
Do you know
trying to
how
drive
many
to
it
is
is?
let's
I'm
drive
just
out that
trying to-
ambiguity between professional services and services. That's question number one, and then the question is then what's the threshold for that?
It looks like for both. Is this for both public service? For both, it's not a whole lot though, because this is for both public works and professionals. This is for all services, public works and professional and general services. And there were missing some. This is not a good list. Oh, okay, never mind. We'll get it for you.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, the question is right now, if we raise the threshold for services, so that means there's some things that won't come to council, but we would lower the threshold for professional services, that means some additional would come to council. And so the kind of the net effect in terms of work is probably going to wash, but what we get is a common number. You don't have to go to Rachel and say services or professional services and get learned legal opinion.
Unless there's like 2 things in services and 5,000 things in professional services, right? In which case, right. But I mean, that's what this 4 square would sort of show us, like what's in to the areas. But I agree with you generally. Wouldn't that be nice if it was sort of a net wash from a net wash from the total things that come before council, but better in the sense that there would be the same threshold, and so this issue of services versus professional services would become
Well, So I think we can recommend to council from this group that we do think there should be one number across the two, unless there's
Unless
a.
it's 350, which
unless-
I don't like.
Oh, well, no, just that on principle, there should
Should be
be
one
a
number.
number that's the same for both. And we would like more information about the frequency of these various values of services so that we can do the same sort of thing with, that's on slide 9. We could know how much this decision impacts how many decisions.
Absolutely, we can get that.
So can we, so to your point, we can agree on the principle. We should have a number for the, but we need to see the more data before we can tell you what that number should be. And then we can just, we'll take that back with, I don't know that we want to meet again to cipher out that number. We can just bring it to the council as a whole. Or do you want
I
to
would
meet
like
again?
to meet again.
Okay, we can meet again then and
And look at
cipher out
that.
that number? Okay,
I think, like you said, if you see what's in those
yeah,
sort of, if you see that list and you see what picking a certain number in there would mean, I think you want to see in that list what things had previously been categorized as services and what had been previously categorized as professional services. Because some of those things you're going to make show up more before council, and some of those things, as you pointed out, you're going to make show up less before council. You know, if you just had one list and you didn't differentiate, then you wouldn't really understand the impact of what it would have on the.
Yeah,
and we did agree though that on Public Works, we're going to tie the council threshold to the procurement threshold.
Correct.
So those are the first two. Whew. So we'll pick up that other one when we have a little more data. So let's move on to the next kind of area of discussion. Any Rachel's questions, which are grant threshold. Any comments, discussion on changing the question, establishing essentially a grant threshold, since right now all for council.
There was
Councilman Martin?
I had the question about which of those grants were public service or were human service grants, because historically that human services grant process was beneficial to the community because it helped the community understand how we were spending that money. And so I was, you know, that's at the heart of my question, right? If we just said all grants below 100,000, I think we would that would wipe out that process, the human services process.
The visibility to it from a council perspective.
Correct.
Yeah.
Perhaps I'm trying to, we're talking about the human services grants that we grant.
Correct.
Correct?
The council historically had a process where the Services and Safety Committee had in the old days it was annually, and the human services organizations that are active in the community, and only one or two of them were more than $100,000. I think the theater was over 100, and I think the senior center, back when the senior center was a separate concern, was over 100. But everything else was under 100. But what it really did was, A, it showed the community, and B, it also, you know, basically made those nonprofits come before us and sort of account for what they were doing, and that are, you know, and I think there was an idea that this human services money was, for lack of a better word, precious, and we wanted to show that it was being well spent. Era where those sorts of things come under some communities with some public scrutiny. We wanted
Yes.
to make sure they understood it was being well spent.
I don't think that the proposed changes to 3.6 will affect that at all, because 3.6 only discusses the grants the city is accepting, not grants that the city's giving. So those shouldn't be affected by that.
So then how does it differ from donation? Donations are from individuals, grants are from institutions. In both cases, it's money the city accepts.
Well, grants are not quite donations because there's technically it's a contract, it's technically some sort of consideration that the city is getting rather than just a flat out, or that the grantee is giving or whoever, yeah.
And the grants also kind of matching components and things like that
Exactly.
that a donation wouldn't
Yep.
have.
I mean, but by my policy criteria, they'd fall under the same category then if they're a contract. And you'd want to put them at the same number. I'd almost argue for a number above 100,000, right? At the same number that we're talking about for services and professional services, right? Because it's commitments to do things. If the city accepts that money, it's going to get used. That money will get almost certainly used for either stuff or salaries, right? Either case, I would argue that criteria, the one FTE criteria, would be valid here as much as it is in the other, as it is with services and professional services. So I would argue for a number above 100.
Okay. I'm not sure that I have a problem with $100,000. I mean, I actually think this is pretty reasonable. And I think the fact that, if there's a match, we have to have the match has to be budgeted and has to be available and all that before we can do it. Again, the 100,000 is because this was zero before, right? So we've gone from 0 to 100. It's again a fairly arbitrary number. Councilmember Hunt, do you have any thoughts on what the level should be on this one?
So if we I think generally, I think that the number seems about right to me. I don't know that it makes sense to tie it to the same number as we talked about earlier, because the other number made more sense to tie to the procurement process. So the number seemed approximately right to me. And these are grants that also, we talked about earlier, but these are grants that are for approved city programs. They're in line with what the city is doing. So if there's small grants that are these are small grants under $100,000 that are going towards existing city programs, that seems reasonable that they don't need to also go by council again, because council already approves the budgeted program that the grant is going towards.
And the only good thing about the grants coming to council is the visit, not the only thing, but one of the good things is the visibility part of it. So that provides public visibility and transparency into the grants that we're accepting, which I think is important. And so the question could be, is there just some sort of a notification, some sort of a reporting, some other vehicle that isn't an approval, but provides that visibility into, these are the 17 grants we accepted, last quarter, and it was for these things, and, something like that, almost into, wish the city administrator stuck around, but into that, some of our performance reportings and kind of operational metric stuff.
I think that makes sense, and I can put some language in about that. I've made a note, but I think that's a good idea. And just, for this group's awareness, like I'm very into government transparency, and I'm also personally just really into being able to find self-serve, as Tisha knows, being able to find my own documents. And so I completely understand the need for the public to be able to see these. My hope is that we can someday have a better, where things will be, we can make contracts available to the public to view without them having to go to council. I think that should be our goal, for ultimate visibility, is people have access to all the contracts, not just the ones that are approved by council. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to me to create a process that requires approval just so those documents will be available online easier. I think we may as well just make them available online easier. I know it's easier said than done.
And this one's actually a big change because we're going from no grants being not coming to council to probably a fair number of them not coming to council.
Right.
So I'm okay as long as we got some way to report on it. That's important. and I don't have anything other than it's a good, finger in the wind. Is $100,000 the right number? It feels okay to me because something bigger than $100,000 is a fairly significant commitment, and the consideration on the city's side will be significant. If it's, $5,000, it's probably not that big of a deal. So it doesn't feel out of bounds, but I'm good with this one. Councilmember Mark?
Yeah, like I said, if anything, would move it up, not down, so I'm totally fine with it.
All right, let's move on to kind of donations and thinking about donations, and it's really the two flavors of donations, right?
And this was one where as I was looking at this after the COW meeting on the 13th and thinking about the feedback about harmonizing 3.72 and 3.73, I was wondering if we really wanted to do that because they were kind of intended to be different, not the same. We certainly can if this group thinks that that's the best way to do it, but I wanted to talk to you about that more before I tried to do that because we weren't having a really extensive conversation at the COW, so I wasn't sure how closely everyone had been able to read it.
Why don't you share your thoughts with us and kind of where you were going and what you wanted to accomplish?
We already have had this section in here about other donation-funded projects. It's what's now labeled as 3.73. And it essentially really just says that the city administrator and finance director will review proposed donation-funded projects, and if they think that they're a wise thing for the city to do, they'll bring it to council. So it's a little bit different. It's like, somebody comes in and they say, we want to give it a donation, but for you to start like a school lunch program or some, I'm just making stuff up, but that would be it would be a new program that a suggestion essentially that they're making. Whereas 3.7.2 really only relates to donations to programs that are already established by the city and budgeted. So I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense to make them the same because they were supposed to be, I think they're different animals here.
So can I just repeat that back at you, maybe with an example? So if someone has a surplus of basketballs and wants to donate them to the Parks and Community Services Department for use in our youth basketball program, that would be a 3.72, and pretty straightforward. If somebody wants to set up a new program involving hockey and having to build a skating rink over Boehm's pool and buy all that equipment, and they're willing to donate the equipment, but we have the skating rink, that would be a 3.73.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that there's merit to separating those things out.
Yeah,
because accepting something that's fairly straightforward makes a lot of sense to me. Something where we've got a commitment or maybe a change in policy and direction does sound like something that it would be good for the council to opine upon. Thoughts?
I agree.
That's Martz?
You know what I would say? 1 FTE year. If it causes us to make a commitment of more than 1 FTE year, it's policy. I'm going to throw that out forever now.
So it's the March rule now. It's the 1 FTE March rule. Okay. So I think we're in agreement that we need a 7.2 and a 7.3, and we recognize that they are not that there's a subtle difference, but it's an important difference, and we want to treat them different. I think that's good. All right. Those are the three things that we were going to tackle tonight. Rachel, what do you got?
Right now I have drafted things in a way where, because often what comes up is expenditures that are not necessarily for a or contracts that aren't necessarily for an expenditure, or expenditures that aren't really necessarily for a service. So I've gone through and sort of broadened the level of purchasing and contract commitment authority section, which is section 4.5, so that we're addressing approval, like thresholds for approval of all types of contracts, because the world of contracts is very vast. I thought it was easier to basically put in everything. So what you will see is a very long list, basically, of examples of types of contracts, trying to make the point that it's all contracts. I realize that there may be things in this list that you don't want to fall within the up to, whether it be up to 100-something thousand or 350,000. That there may be things that, regardless of the amount, you still want to approve, and that's fine. I just wanted to give you a list so then we can maybe pull those out and say, because it's easier if we have some exceptions rather than just having no discussion of those types of contracts.
I have a couple thoughts on that, but I'll ask Councilmember Hunt and Martz first if you have any thoughts. I'm going to jump then. I have two things. I looked at the list that's on page 10 that made me go, One of them was settlement agreements. If my understanding of a settlement agreement is correct, which is that is, of some sort of a legal action, we are settling it. I don't want to do that without regardless of the dollar amount, without visibility to the council. That feels like an important one to me. And then the other one is real estate purchases and sale agreement. I'm not sure that I want the mayor or the administration going out and buying property without council's guidance, because those two feel very policy to me. The others, looking through it, the lease agreement and MOUs and short-term use of city facilities. Those all seem, I appreciate the list, but those are the only two that I don't know.
Yeah, and I will take a look. Thank you. That's why I was bringing up my laptop. But in my mind. But in the interim, I will say the difference between those two. I'm with you on the legal stuff. Thank you, settlement agreement, because that's a case where the value of that settlement agreement can be extremely open to interpretation and extremely in the eye of the beholder. Property is less so, right? Because property, we have a rigorous process for determining the value of a property, right? So I would, at first blush, I'm not as concerned about the property piece. Although, of course, you could, I guess, have a small dollar value, something that by acquiring it would have a big policy because of use, like if it's different use. If you acquired a coffee shop and decided to turn it into a Shell site, for instance, that would have public policy implications that we would want to be part of. But, generally the dollar value, as opposed to a settlement agreement, where the dollar value could be orders of magnitude off. Thank you.
Councilmember Hunt, any thoughts there?
First, I had a question. The previous version of the threshold was $100,000 for all of these kinds of contracts. Is that right? Or
The previous version didn't address all these types of contracts.
well, it didn't list them, which is nice to clarify, but it would have covered in practice all of these contracts?
That was one of the things that was really unclear about the policy, was that it was the way it was written. It almost implied that it was just for services, but I'll tell you, in practice, we've just been interpreting it essentially to mean most of these types of things, with the exception of things like anything that touches real estate, we've still been bringing to the council, because per state law, the council unless the council delegates that authority, it's up to the council. So, but yes, other agreements, we've been treating them like that, even though it's kind of silent, just because, we had to have some process for them. It's better to have that process than nothing, but so yes and no, I guess.
Okay. Is there a legal argument around that you would make about why we should have a threshold for the settlement agreements? Like, its efficiency is important, or is that one is okay to, in your
I
opinion?
think that that one's generally okay. The only time where it's occasionally would be nice to be able to enter like little measly settlement agreements here and there. Sometimes settlement of like grievance arbitrations, those types of things can be sort of minor, may not even have like a payout involved in them. But I still don't think it's that difficult to have to take them back to the council in an executive session. I'm not really worried about it. I just more want to be able to say one way or the other, so that when staff come to me and they say the settlement agreement, I will be able to point and say, nope, those all go to council. I'm fine either way.
I'm a big fan of driving ambiguity out of the decision-making process too, so it just makes life easier for everybody to know what the ground rules are.
Okay. In that case, it didn't seem that there was a strong efficiency argument for necessarily keeping settlements on the list. So I think settlements in real estate coming off the list would make sense, and also because real estate is singled out by the state to that council has to delegate authority. So I think
For real estate, would you like it, what about leases? That's one. I can completely see where this council would want to maybe retain its authority to like lease city property. I would love to have some language in here so that we don't have to do things like take back the self-storage facility lease to you for $25 a month. Maybe, even if it was a lower limit, just some limit where the city can lease property under a certain value or something like that would be nice.
Councilor Hunt, you got a thought?
thought was 50, but it's not based on anything.
Yeah, I actually don't really, I think leases could be covered by the same contract level
Okay.
as we're talking about.
So we're talking about real estate purchase or sale, is
Yeah,
really, okay,
yeah,
I'll just make
and I
sure I
think,
have my
you know,
notes per.
Yeah, that's kind of my take on it. I have great faith in our, our leadership that they're not going to make stupid leasing decisions within some realms.
And
Right.
then, let's see, what were the other? Yeah, those are really the only ones that I kind of thought that the council might want to still have most of these, like I said, are really just, it's kind of a boring, exhaustive list.
I have, Councilmember Hunt.
I had one miscellaneous thing, which is the CIP. I can't tell from the red line, but it looks like the table of CIP criteria is still in here, and we have changed the CIP criteria for evaluating projects. So I think that one also, since that might change again, it seems like that one should just reference our CIP.
Reference the CIP. Do you have the page number in front of you, just so I can?
I have this section at 6.2.
Perfect.
18.
That's good, I got it. All right, I'll make a note here that we need to just reference the CIP.
You want any nitpicks tonight?
I love nitpicks.
Okay.
Oh, anytime.
All right. When we get the meaty stuff done, I just have like 3 or 4 little niggly things that I found reading through it that I thought maybe I would share with you.
As a nitpicker, I'm always ready for more feedback.
All right. Anything else on the kind of the meaty stuff, or any other nitpicks from the other members of the committee?
What about the change order language? Was that acceptable to you? I wanted to give some sort of administrative approval for change orders. What I've seen a lot of agencies do is, you set a budget for a project that includes the 20% contingency. So often, while we don't broadcast the contingency to the contractor for obvious reasons, we know that that portion might get spent with change orders. So I have written it in to basically allow us to use the to allow change orders up to the contingency without council approval. This does come up fairly frequently because, there's a hurry with a change order and nobody wants to wait. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll jump. I'm okay with that. I mean, particularly since we generally budget the contingency, I'm not too worried about that. Not that I want to spend the contingency, if we don't have to, but under the banner of efficiency and everything, let's not bog down the project when there's money budgeted, and I take on that. And I know, and I quite honestly spent too much time on the other side of that equation, and it's very frustrating contract to be waiting around for approval, which is generally pretty perfunctory.
Yep, people won't work with you again. Sometimes it
Yep.
becomes a pain. Yep. Thank you. Tisha, am I missing any of the meaty issues we talked about?
No, but I am hoping we can talk a bit about scheduling before the meeting concludes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have to get my nits in, though.
The
before
nits,
anything
yes,
else.
please, I'm ready.
All right, so
Tell me what page.
there are some fun ones here.
Okay.
My favorite is on page 13, section 4.7, emergency purchases. You struck citizens. Life, health, and safety of staff or likely to result in damage to city and/or property. And we left out you struck the safety of citizens.
I meant to just change citizens to residents.
Yeah.
Is that change acceptable?
Oh, no, I don't see residents either. The version I have just shows citizens being
No, it
struck.
said, you're right. I meant to
Oh,
change it,
okay.
and I think I just didn't type in that word.
Residents is fine.
Okay. Okay.
I just think it's important that we take care of them.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I would add to that section is a notification to the city council at the next opportunity that we did that.
Okay.
Just it's similar to language elsewhere where you got the notification. And then that just might be it. That might be my only real nit. I had a question in my own mind about kind of why retainage was set at 5% and why retainage management is a hard process, but I'm going to believe you guys that it is. It just doesn't seem like it to me, but I'm going to trust you to do the right thing on that.
I get a lot of complaints about it. I don't deal with it myself, so I don't know how hard it is, but it is complained to me about on a weekly basis.
Okay.
So.
All right. And my other nit is we refer to our finance director and not our chief financial officer.
Yep, I noticed that, and I was thinking about that during this meeting.
Yeah,
Wait a second, those references aren't correct.
Yeah, I had to go to the city website and make sure that we had the right name for the position.
I'll just make that change throughout the whole document too, yeah.
Getting notes. Ooh. Okay. I'm okay with that. We have a member of the public online, and they've got their hand raised. And though we may be past the public comment period, I'm willing to do it if my colleagues are willing to do public comment. Yes. City Clerk, let's see who's on and what we get. Oh, I got to read the rules. Read the rules first. Okay, public comments are an important part of the public process. We take them seriously and factor them into decisions we make. During audience comment, members of the public are invited to address the council regarding matters that are directly related to city programs, projects, services, or events. Please direct comments to the whole council, or committee in this case, not individuals. While this is not a question and answer session, we will contact you to follow up as needed. When recognize, unmute your mic. State your name, address, relation to the city, speak clearly, pause frequently, and limit your comments to 5 minutes. If you are attending virtually and we lose connection, we encourage you to rejoin the meeting if you are able. Personal attacks, obscene language, derogatory comments, and disruptive behavior will not be permitted. Clerk, can you identify the first person who has indicated a desire to speak?
Yes, CM, I'm going to make you a panelist now. You can choose to turn your video on and unmute. Give me just a moment here. All right, you should be able to unmute and make your comments.
Start my video. There we go. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Connie Marsh, live up on Squawk. Just popped mom out of the hospital and I wanted to come to the meeting, but there was no time. So my concerns are the public transparency. So I have found that when you say you're going to do a dashboard or something like that, the dashboards fall away and are not updated. And having to come to the city council actually forces people to bring things into the light. And so while everybody is behaving great and everybody's honest and awesome, then the system of not bringing things to the council works fine. But in the case of a situation where everyone is not awesome, when it is not shown to the city council, then bad things can happen. And I just want to caution that these are safety valve type things that you're talking about. And it's important to remember that you're working on safety valves. So some of my things that are, I think, important enough to bring to council are MOUs, because, for example, an MOU with WashDOT, it might not actually even have a financial thing, but it is super important. MOUs with the school district, same thing. And so I would like to understand, even if we have it in our policies and we want to do it, it just seems like those types of things should still come to council, and it's unclear to me whether they would. Also, when you talk about all of the leasing of the city, I think I said this in my emails, of the city properties. Now, the total leasing amounts go above these values, but the individual leasings don't. But my concern is we need equitable policies for all of this leasing, and unless there's some sort of oversight, that it's going to get even more chaotic than it already is. So these are some of the concerns that I have in the situation. One last little nitpick is sorry, Chris, using your word, is the entrance thing and being able to enter private businesses. I don't really understand what that means. I don't understand what the city sees and the city council sees already, but it doesn't seem like that should be a standard state of affairs, that the city should just be able to go into into private areas willy-nilly. So those are my concerns, and I appreciate you listening to me tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Connie, appreciate it. All right, anybody else online, City Clerk?
No.
Okay, now we're going to close public comment. Thanks. I'm going to try and summarize kind of what I think we agreed to. So on the contract thresholds, we're going to do a couple, we're asking for a couple things. One is for the public works contracts to bring together the thresholds for requiring a procurement with the thresholds for coming to council. So if you meet the requirement to do a procurement, then it needs to come before, that contract needs to come before council for approval. We agree that we want to have a single threshold for services contracts and professional services contract, though we haven't arrived at what that threshold level is yet. On grants, I think we're good with the proposed language. And also, I think on donations, we're good with the proposed language and the separation of the donations into two kind of major categories. One which is very kind of business as usual, and one that is more kind of new and more policy, with the second one coming for act, and the first one being usual. We had some comments on what falls inside of scope of contracts. I think real estate and settlement agreements were the two that we collectively thought should be outside of the thresholds and should come. I think that's what, and then a couple little things. I think Councilmember Martz.
Can I just ask for clarification? Memorandums of understanding always come up for the council. Okay?
Memorandum of understanding isn't really, it's not really a thing. It's just another name for a contract. So it's, I don't need it. I've got it. Thanks. So they don't, right now they're not addressed. A lot of interlocal agreements are titled MOU. You really have to read the agreement and to figure out whether or not it's just a general MOU / interagency contract versus an ILA. All ILAs come to council, and
Okay.
those are all interlocal agreements are by statute. It's 3934030, I believe. They're contracts for a joint purpose or project, like a joint undertaking. So, you know, we do have some interlocal agreements. For instance, the interlocal agreement for, you know, like for provision of court services, because we do it jointly with other entities. Those are interlocal agreements. Not every you know, we enter, what I see a lot of, here's an example, an MOU for data sharing. And so it'll be, you know, just an MOU where we say for instance, I saw one recently for human services, and it was, you know, we'll protect your information, you'll protect ours, and this is just between the city and EFR. So it is an interagency agreement. It's titled MOU, but it's not an interlocal agreement at all. It's just truly.
But we had an MOU associated with the transit-oriented development that did not have a specific dollar value associated. But it was an MOU, and it was a policy document. It was basically, you know, you, King County Public Housing, if you buy this from those guys, our intention is this, therefore this other thing. But it didn't have specific dollars associated with it, but it was a policy commitment.
I mean, to me, that's actually an ILA that just didn't get called an ILA. I'd say 50% of the time they're actually referenced as an interlocal agreement, and then folks call them MOUs, interagency agreements, whatever. But I think things like that would still come to council because they are like for a joint program.
Okay, so what you're saying is the scenario where you would have an important MOU that would have a small dollar value doesn't really exist, because you have an ILA that is covered by statute, or you've got an MOU that's really a contract, and then we have the criteria that we just spent the last hour and a half hammering out.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to.
All right. Councilmember Hunt.
I thought you did a great job summarizing. The one thing that we did talk about that I think would be good to tell council is we did suggest ways to make sure that information is captured so that the public and so that council knows, even if it doesn't stop the process or slow the process or add steps. And I was just looking in the third quarter budget report, which came to council as on consent. It's just sort of a ID report out that already actually summarizes some of the grants that go by council currently, but I think that would be a good place to put the grants information, to have a summary of the grants information, just so for transparency. Or if there's a different suggestion from the staff, that would also be fine, but I think that was a part of our conversation that would be good to capture.
Thanks for that. Anything else? Councilmember Martz? Robert, Rachel, you got what you need or a good start, and then we'll plan on getting back together one more time briefly, kind of walk through those numbers and kind of hammer out a threshold. I know the city clerk is anxious that we do some scheduling, so so help me with the constraints on scheduling.
Sure. So as the city council formed this committee, their directive was to report back at the January 16th council meeting for the committee to report back. So I see one evening that looks open on the city calendar, and that is January 11th. But if that is not feasible for the committee members, I might recommend that basically the agenda bill be updated to say the committee met, summarize your conversation, explain the need for an additional meeting, and then have this item return back to the full council, maybe at the February 5th council meeting, to allow you to have a second meeting if that's what's desired. The other alternative would be to, not have a second committee meeting and push the conversation back to the full council at the meeting on the 16th.
I would love January 11th. I have EFER until nominally 6 o'clock, but at 6, I could be back.
Okay, Councilmember Hunt, I can do it. Let's do that. Let's schedule a follow-up ad hoc meeting for January 1124, January 11th, 2024.
And then if you don't mind my posing the question to Rachel, if the committee is able to meet on the 11th, what do you think about the ability to turn around for the meeting on the 16th?
That should be no problem. I think I have the bulk of what I need now, and we're really just talking more about specific numbers then, so that should work fine. Thank you for asking.
Do you want to do 6 o'clock? I mean, does 6 o'clock work for this? Work for you? And Councilmember March, you can bail out of the EFER meeting if it seems to run long.
It does not run
I
long.
know.
As you well know. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, I think thank you for staying late and being here on the week before the holiday. We really appreciate it. And Councilmember March.
I just want to thank you, Chris, for stepping in. I've not been in a committee structure before where we didn't know who the chair was, or at least have a good idea who the chair was coming in. And I thought you were very well prepared. You did a great job and were well prepared, given that you didn't know you were going to be chair.
Well, thank you for that. It was fine. I mean, I couldn't ask for a better committee, quite honestly. All right. So with that, I think we've gotten through today's business, and we are adjourned at 7:37.